Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm painting up this Necron Skorpekh Destroyer of the Novokh Dynasty. This was a really fun one to work on. I really wanted to create this scene that depicted the Skorpekh Destroyer moving through the battlefield, so without any more delay, let's get into it. First step I'm going to do is I'm just going to base the model in some Chaos Black. Once that is going to dry, I'm going to move on to getting our base layer of Iron Warriors on. As with almost all of our other paints, I'm going to be thinning this down just a tiny amount to improve the flow right out of the pot. I feel like it doesn't take as much water to thin down as non-metallics, but every paint's a little bit different. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight our base layer, and for that I'm using Warpaint Fanatic Mithril. I'm using a dry brush for this step, using mostly just stippling motions, but you could also use a sponge if you want to, or you could just stick to your brush. I wanted to bring in a different metallic into our scheme that we have so far, so for the icon on this chest I'm using Runelord Brass. Next paint I'm going to be using is Mephiston Red, and I'm going to be applying this to the lower end of his legs, his head, and his main shoulder or back armor. If you're using the same pot of water, now would be a good idea to clean it out and replace it with clean water. I find that using the same water after using metallic paints, I can get some small flakes of the metallic onto my brush, and that can appear on the next layer of paint if you didn't wash your brush well enough. So just be aware of that. To highlight our red, I'm using Evil Sunz Scarlet. This step I've thinned this down a little bit more than usual, and I'm concentrating on applying this to the upper portions of each red section on the model. I'm not being clean here, I'm kind of just slapping it on, but when it dries it creates a nice texture to it that I like. Another method to do this I've done in the past is using a makeup sponge, or you could just dry brush this as well. At this point, I'm going to add a white stripe down the center of his head. I'm using some bold titanium white and a small brush, and I'm slowly just drawing that line down the center, then going back and expanding it to how thick I want the stripe to be. Once the stripe is done, I'm going to go back to Evil Sunz Scarlet, and I'm going to add some super small chips and scratches that go into the stripe for a little bit of weathering. And for some additional weathering, I'm going to rip off a piece of cheap makeup sponge, and I'm going to be using some Rhinox hide here. I'm going to start dabbing some paint onto the model to create some chipping effects. With this, I like to dab off a good amount of paint onto a paper towel before going onto the model, and just to start off light to get a good feel for how the paint is applying onto the model before I keep going. Let's add some more highlights to our red armor, and for this I'm going to be using Wild Rider Red, and I'm going to be edge highlighting the edges of the light that would be hitting. So I'm not edge highlighting every edge, just the top facing edges for the most part to create some volumetric lighting. Now let's move on to the wash. As usual, I'm using Winter Streaking Grime, and I'm mixing it with Mineral Spirits to a mix of roughly 50-50 or 60-40 washed and Mineral Spirit. I'm using a cheap brush to apply it, and I'm covering the whole model with it. Once everything is applied, I'm going to immediately grab a Q-tip, and I'm going to lightly dampen the Q-tip and start working the excess off. It's always a little tricky knowing how much you need to take off to get the look you're going for, but once you do a model or two, you get a pretty good idea. Now you can let it air dry, or you can blast it with a hair dryer to help speed up the process, but after it is good and dry, I'm going to move on to a black wash to primarily get it into the recesses, but I'm also going to use it to darken the metal in a few spots, so when we go and highlight the metal once again, we get a nice contrast between the dirty metal and highlights. For the hyperphase blades, I've decided to do multiple layers upon layers of our black wash to get the metal on them a really dark but not totally black look. Now let's highlight our metal, and I'm going to go back to using Warpaint Fanatic Mithril. I'm going to edge highlight in the same method as I did with the Wild Rider Red and concentrate on applying this to the areas where the light would reflect most off the model, but this is just a general guideline that I set for myself. I don't follow it religiously, so you can highlight as many edges as you want. So here we are so far, and it's looking pretty good. Now let's work on the blades. So I wanted to keep the blades pretty simple. I didn't want to do a lot of work on them, so what I decided to do was I was going to have there be a recessed glow effect inside, or instead of the glow being on the faces of the blade, so I wanted it to be in the recesses of the blade here. To start, I'm going to thin down some white paint, and I'm going to, as carefully as I can, I'm going to work in layers to create this gradient from thin down white on the outsides of the blade to a more opaque white towards the center. Once you have that down, the next step is to grab some fluorescent green paint and apply it over our white paint to create that glow effect. Now this paint I'm using is from Green Stuff World, which had been sitting on my shelf for a long ass time, so it's a little difficult to work with, but it still got the job done. After we have a layer down, I'm going to go back to my white paint, apply it over the green where we want a little brighter color, and then I'm going to go back to our fluorescent green, thinning it down, and applying it just over the white paint that we just applied. For the rest of the glowing effect, like on the eyes and the nodules on his legs and arms, the process is the exact same as the blades. And with that, our model is done. I printed out a bunch of 3D bits and a base to put the model on to create that story of the Skorpekh Destroyer moving through the battlefield over all the Kree corpses. I guess just one in this case. But looking back on this model, since this was like 2 months between painting this and now kind of editing this video, I like how the metallics turned out, and I really like the red. The blades kind of feel meh on. I feel like it would look better if I was a little bit more patient. Maybe try a different style of hyperphase blades. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too critical on myself, but that's just what I think now looking at it. Thank you everyone for stopping by and checking this out. I have a ton of other Necron models that are just sitting here that I want to paint up with different dynasties, so if there's a scheme that you would like to see, post a comment below. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you on the next one.